Well, here we are. It's Wednesday, August 24th, 2022. I'm Larissa, and today I'm going to start reading a book, right? I've read my books. I'm going to read somebody else's book. I saw an article that there are authors all over the world reading aloud from Salman Rushdie's books while he's recovering. And to Mr. Rushdie, thank you for your work. Like, I don't know your work very well, right? Because your work has never been my literary aesthetic, right? But I'm not everybody's literary aesthetic, right? And as an artist, for the love of cheese pizza, I know what it's like to be maligned for your artwork. Anyway, I have a couple of your books on my bookshelf in my library here, and this is the one I'm going to start reading, or I'm going to read. I'll do a chapter at a time like I did my books. Haroun and the Sea of Stories. So I have this one. There's like two others up there, but this was the first one I came across. So that's why we're reading this one. But there was a time. This one has a tag inside of it. We used to rent a loft, a live-work loft in Oakland. And one of the things I was trying to do there is establish a library, a lending library. And so have this tag inside of here in this book. Some of my books have that, not all of them do. This woman, I was talking to other residents. She's like, "Oh, Larissa, you just read books online." I'm like, "Oh, no. It's a very different thing. It's a very, very different thing to hold a book in your hand. And also, when you have the printed word in your hand, it can't be changed by someone, at a computer desk, right? This isn't Wikipedia. This is a printed novel." And she's like, "Oh, that's not worthwhile. I just gave all my books away." I'm just like, well, she didn't have any books in her house. And somebody once told me you should be very leery of a person who does not have books in their house. And it's a very telling thing. If you look at the books on somebody's bookshelf, you know a lot about them. And I will always remember that, because there's a couple people in my life who, if I had looked at their bookshelf and made that association, my life would be a lot different and would have been a lot better. Anyway, Mr. Rushdie, I am so sorry about what happened to you, sir. Haroun and the Sea of Stories, a novel by Mr. Salman Rushdie. I'm not going to read all these pages. Zembla, Zenda, Xanadu, all our dream worlds may come true. Fairylands are fearsome too, as I wander far from view. Read and bring me home to you. 1. The Shah of Blah. There was once, in the country of Alif Bay, a sad city, the saddest of cities, a city so ruinously sad that it had forgotten its name. It stood by a mournful sea full of glum fish, which were so miserable to eat that they made people black with melancholy, even though the skies were blue. In the north of the sad city stood mighty factories in which, so I'm told, sadness was actually manufactured, packaged, and sent all over the world, which never seemed to get enough of it. Black smoke poured out of the chimneys of the sadness factories and hung over the city like bad news. And in the depths of the city, beyond an old zone of ruined buildings that looked like broken hearts, there lived a happy young fellow by the name of Haroun, the only child of the storyteller Rashid Khalifa, whose cheerfulness was famous throughout the unhappy metropolis, and whose never-ending stream of tall, short, and winding tales had earned him not one, but two nicknames. To his admirers, he was Rashid, the ocean of notions, as stuffed with cheery stories as the sea was full of glumfish, but to his jealous rivals, he was the Shah of Blah. To his wife, Soroya, Rashid was for many years as loving a husband as anyone could wish for, and during these years Haroun grew up in a home in which, instead of misery and frowns, he had his father's ready laughter and his mother's sweet voice raised in song. Then something went wrong. Maybe the sadness of the city finally crept in through their windows. The day Soroya stopped singing, in the middle of a line, as if someone had thrown a switch, Haroun guessed there was trouble brewing. But he never suspected how much. Rashid Khalifa was so busy making up and telling stories that he didn't notice that Soroya no longer sang, which probably made things worse. But then Rashid was a busy man in constant demand. He was the ocean of notions, the famous Shah of Blah, and what with all his rehearsals and performances, Rashid was so often on stage that he lost track of what was going on in his own home. He sped around the city and the country telling stories while Soroya stayed home, turning cloudy and even a little thunderous and brewing up quite a storm. Haroun went with his father whenever he could because the man was a magician. It couldn't be denied. He would climb up on some little makeshift stage in dead-end alley packed with raggedy children and toothless old-timers, all squatting in the dust, and once he got going, even the city's many wandering cows would stop and cock their ears, and monkeys would jabber approvingly from rooftops, and the parrots in the trees would imitate his voice. Haroun often thought of his father as a juggler because his stories were really lots of different tales juggled together, and Rashid kept them going in a sort of dizzy whirl and never made a mistake. Where did all these stories come from? It seemed that all Rashid had to do was part his lips, and a plump red smile, and out would pop some brand new saga, complete with sorcery, love interest, princesses, wicked uncles, fat aunts, mustached gangsters in yellow check pants, fantastic locations, cowards, heroes, fights, and half a dozen catchy, hummable tunes. Everything comes from somewhere, Haroun reasoned, so these stories can't simply come out of thin air. But whenever he asked his father this most important of questions, the Shah of Blah would narrow his, to tell the truth, slightly bulging eyes, and pat his wobbly stomach, and stick his thumb between his lips while he made a ridiculous drinking noise, glug, glug, glug. Haroun hated it when his father acted this way. No, come on, where do they come from, really? He'd insist, and Rashid would wiggle his eyebrows mysteriously and make witchy fingers in the air. From the great story sea, he'd reply. I drink the warm story waters, and then I feel full of steam. Haroun found this statement intensely irritating. Where do you keep this hot water, then? He argued craftily. In hot water bottles, I suppose? Well, I've never seen any. It comes out of an invisible tap installed by one of the water genies, said Rashid with a straight face. You have to be a subscriber. And how do you become a subscriber? Oh, said the Shah of Blah. That's much too complicated to explain. Anyhow, said Haroun grumpily, I've never seen a water genie either. Rashid shrugged. You're never up in time to see the milkman, he pointed out, but you don't mind drinking the milk. So now kindly desist from this iffing and butting and be happy with the stories you enjoy. And that was the end of that. Except that one day, Haroun asked one question too many, and then all hell broke loose. The Khalifas lived in the downstairs part of a small concrete house with pink walls, lime green windows, and blue-painted balconies with squiggly metal railings, all of which made it look, in Haroun's view, more like a cake than a building. It wasn't a grand house, nothing like the skyscrapers where the super-rich folks lived. Then again, it was nothing like the dwellings of the poor either. The poor lived in tumble-down shacks made out of old cardboard boxes and plastic sheeting, and these shacks were glued together by despair. And then there were the super-poor, who had no homes at all. They slept on pavements and in doorways of shops and had to pay rent to local gangsters for doing even that. So the truth is that Haroun was lucky. But luck has a way of running out without the slightest warning. One minute you've got a lucky star watching over you, and the next instant it's done a bunk. In the sad city, people mostly had big families, but the poor children got sick and starved, while the rich kids overate and quarreled over their parents' money. Still, Haroun wanted to know why his parents hadn't had more children, but the only answer he ever got from Rashid was no answer at all. There's more to you, young Haroun Khalifa, than meets the blinking eye. Well, what was that supposed to mean? We used up our full quota of child stuff just in making you, Rashid explained. It's all packed in there. Enough for maybe 4 or 5 kitties. Yes, sir, more to you than the blinking eye can see. Straight answers were beyond the power of Rashid Khalifa, who would never take a shortcut if there was a longer, twistier road available. Soraya gave Haroun a simple reply. We tried, she sadly said. The child business is not such an easy thing. Think of the poor Senguptas. The Senguptas lived upstairs. Mr. Sengupta was a clerk at the office in the city corporation. He was a sticky thin and whiny voiced, and Minji, as his wife Onita was, generous and loud and wobbly fat. They had no children at all, and as a result, Onita Sengupta paid more attention to Haroun than he really cared for. She brought him sweetmeats, which was fine, and ruffled his hair, which wasn't. And when she hugged him, the great cascades of her flesh seemed to surround him completely, to his considerable alarm. Mr. Sengupta ignored Haroun, but was always talking to Soraya, which Haroun didn't like, particularly as the fellow would launch into criticisms of Rashid, the storyteller, whenever he thought Haroun wasn't listening. That husband of yours, excuse me if I mention, he would start in his thin, whiny voice. He's got his head stuck in the air and his feet off the ground. What are all these stories? Life is not a storybook or a joke shop. All this fun will come to no good. What's the use of stories that aren't even true? Haroun, listening hard outside the window, decided he did not care for Mr. Sengupta, this man who hated stories and storytellers. He didn't care for him one little bit. What's the use of stories that aren't even true? Haroun couldn't get the terrible question out of his head. However, there were people who thought Rashid's stories were useful. In those days, it was almost election time, and the grand panjandrums of various political parties all came to Rashid, smiling their fat cat smiles, to beg him to tell his stories at their rallies and nobody else's. It was well known that if you could get Rashid's magic tongue on your side, then your troubles were over. Nobody ever believed anything a politico said, even though they pretended as hard as they could that they were telling the truth. In fact, this was how everyone knew they were lying. But everyone had complete faith in Rashid because he always admitted that everything he told them was completely untrue and made up out of his own head. So the politicos needed Rashid to help him win the people's votes. They lined up outside his door with their shiny faces and fake smiles and bags of hard cash. Rashid could pick and choose. One day, that evening went wrong. On the day that everything went wrong, Haroun was on his way home from school when he was caught in the first downpour of the rainy season. Now, when the rains came to the sad city, life became a little easier to bear. There were delicious pomfret in the sea at that time of year, so people could have a break from the glum fish, and the air was cool and clean because the rain washed away most of the black smoke billowing out of the sadness factories. Haroun Khalifa loved the feeling of getting soaked to the skin in the first rain of the year, so he skipped about and got a wonderful warm drenching and opened his mouth to let the raindrops plop on his tongue. He arrived home looking as wet and shiny as a pomfret in the sea. Miss Onita was standing on her upstairs balcony shaking like a jelly, and if it hadn't been raining, Haroun might have noticed that she was crying. He went indoors and found Rashid, the storyteller, looking as if he'd stuck his face out of the window because his eyes and cheeks were soaking wet even though his clothes were dry. Haroun's mother, Soraya, had run off with Mr. Sengupta. At 11 a.m. precisely, she had sent Rashid into Haroun's room, telling him to search for some missing socks. A few seconds later, while he was busy with the hunt, Haroun was good at losing socks, Rashid heard the front door slam, and an instant later, the sound of a car in the lane. He turned to the living room to find his wife gone, and a taxi speeding away around the corner. She must have planned it all very carefully, he thought. The clock still stood at 11 o'clock exactly. Rashid picked up a hammer and smashed the clock to bits. Then he broke every other clock in the house, including the one in Haroun's bedside table. The first thing Haroun said on hearing the news of his mother's departure was, "What did you have to break my clock for?" Soraya had left a note full of all the nasty things Mr. Sengupta used to say about Rashid. You are only interested in pleasure, but a proper man would know that life is a serious business. Your brain is full of make-believe, so there's no room in it for facts. Mr. Sengupta has no imagination at all. This is okay by me. There was a postscript. Tell Haroun I love him, but I can't help it. I have to do this now. Rainwater dripped onto the note from Haroun's hair. What to do, son? Rashid pleaded piteously. Storytelling is the only work I know. When he heard his father sounding so pathetic, Haroun lost his temper and shouted, What's the point of it? What's the use of stories that aren't even true? Rashid hid his face in his hands and wept. Haroun wanted to get those words back, to pull them out of his father's ears and shove them back into his own mouth, but of course he couldn't do that, and that was why he blamed himself when soon afterwards, in the most embarrassing circumstances imaginable, the unthinkable happened. Rashid Khalifa, the legendary ocean of notions, the fabled Shah of Blah, stood up in front of a huge audience, opened his mouth, and found that he had run out of stories to tell. After his mother left home, Haroun found he couldn't keep his mind on anything for very long, or, to be precise, for more than 11 minutes at a time. Rashid took him to a movie to cheer him up, but after exactly 11 minutes, Haroun's attention wandered, and when the film ended, he had no idea how it all turned out, and he had to ask Rashid if the good guys won in the end. The next day, Haroun was playing goalie in a neighborhood game of street hockey, and after pulling off a string of brilliant saves in the first 11 minutes, he began to let in the softest, most foolish, and most humiliating of goals. And so it went on. His mind was always wandering off somewhere and leaving his body behind. This created certain difficulties because many interesting and some important things take longer than 11 minutes. Meals, for example. Also, mathematics examinations. It was Onita Sengupta who put her finger on the trouble. She had started coming downstairs even more often than before, for instance, to announce defiantly, No more Mrs. Sengupta for me. From today, call me Miss Onita only. After which she smacked her forehead violently and wailed, Oh, what is to become? When Rashid told Miss Onita about Haroun's wandering attention, however, she spoke firmly and with certainty. 11 o'clock, when his mother exited, she declared. Now comes this problem of 11 minutes. Cause is located in his pussycology. It took Rashid and Haroun a few moments to work out that she meant psychology. Owing to pussycology sadness, Miss Onita continued, that young master is stuck fast on his 11 number and can't not get to 12. That's not true, Haroun protested, but in his heart he feared it might be. Was he stuck in time like a broken clock? Maybe the problem would never be solved unless and until Soraya returned to start the clocks up once again. Some days later, Rashid Khalifa was invited to perform by politicos from the town of G and the nearby valley of K, which nestled in the mountain of M. I should explain that in the country of Alif Bey, many places were named after letters of the alphabet. This led to much confusion because there were only a limited number of letters and an almost unlimited number of places in need of names. As a result, many places were obliged to share a single name. This meant that people's letters were always going into the wrong address. Such difficulties were made even worse by the way in which certain places, such as Sad City, forgot their names entirely. The employees of the National Mail Service had a lot to put up with, as you can imagine, so they could get a little excitable on occasion. We should go, Rashid said to Haroun, putting a brave face on things. In the town of G and the valley of K, the weather is still fine, whereas here the air is too weepy for words. It was true that it was raining so hard in Sad City that you could almost drown just by breathing in. Miss Onita, who just happened to have dropped in from upstairs, agreed sadly with Rashid. Tip-top plan, she said. Yes, both of you go. It will be like a little holiday, and no need to worry about me sitting all by myself. The town of G is not so special, Rashid told Haroun as the train carried them towards that very place. But the valley of K, now that is different. There are fields of gold and mountains of silver, and in the middle of the valley there is a beautiful lake, whose name, by the way, is Dull. If it's so beautiful, why isn't it called interesting? Haroun argued, and Rashid, making a huge effort to be in a good mood, tried to put on his old witchy fingers act. Now, the interesting lake, he said in his most mysterious voice. Now that's something else again. That's a lake of many names. Yes, sir, so it is. Rashid went on trying to sound happy. He told Haroun about the luxury class houseboat waiting for them on the Dull Lake. He talked about the ruined fairy castle in the Silver Mountains and about the pleasure gardens built by the ancient emperors, which came right down to the edge of the dull lake. Gardens with fountains and terraces and pavilions of pleasure where the spirits of the ancient kings still flew about in the guise of hoopoe birds. But after exactly 11 minutes, Haroun stopped listening, and Rashid stopped talking too, and they stared silently out of the window of the railway carriage at the unfolding boredom of the plains. They were met at the railway station in the town of G by two unsmiling men wearing gigantic mustachios and loud yellow check pants. They look like villains to me, Haroun thought, but he kept his opinion to himself. The two men drove Rashid and Haroun straight to the political rally. They drove past buses that dripped people the way sponge drips water, and arrived at a thick forest of human beings, a crowd of people sprouting in all directions like leaves on jungle trees. There were great bushes of children, rows of ladies arranged in lines like flowers in a giant flower bed. Rashid was deep in his own thoughts and was nodding sadly to himself. Then the thing happened, the unthinkable thing. Rashid went out onto the stage in front of that vast jungle of a crowd, and Haroun watched him from the wings. And the poor storyteller opened his mouth, and the crowd squealed in excitement, and now Rashid Khalifa, standing there with his mouth hanging open, found that it was as empty as his heart. Ark! Was all that came out. The Shah of Blah sounded like a stupid crow. Ark! 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 After that, they were shut up in a steaming hot office, while the two men with the mustachios and loud yellow check pants shouted at Rashid and accused him of having taken a bribe from their rivals, and suggested that they might cut off his tongue and other items also. And Rashid, close to tears, kept repeating that he couldn't understand why he had dried up, and promising to make it up to them. In the Valley of K, I will be terrifico, magnifique, he vowed. Better you are, the mustachioed men shouted back, or else out comes the tongue from your lying throat. So when does the plane leave for K? Haroun butted in, hoping to calm things down. The train, he knew, didn't go into the mountains. The shouting men began to shout even more loudly. Plane? Plane? His papa's stories won't take off, but the brat wants to fly. No plane for you, Mr. and Sonny. Catch a blasted bus. My fault again, Haroun thought wretchedly. I started this all off. What's the use of stories that aren't even true? I asked that question, and it broke my father's heart, so it's up to me to put things right. Something has to be done. The only trouble was he couldn't think of a single thing. Not bad. Interesting to be reading right now in these times, huh? Feel better soon, Mr. Rushdie. Next clip, I'll read chapter 2.